interesting enough, there's been a number of studies that have looked at actually both osteoporosis and pelvic prolapse, or osteoporosis and stress incontinence. It's like leaking when you cough, laugh, sneeze, which is indicative of weak ligaments. But the question was in their study was, is osteoporosis and prolapse, a weakening of the pelvic floor, directly related? And I don't think that they're directly related, but I think the process that's causing both, or one of the processes that's causing these conditions, is adding to these risks, both the risks of these conditions.
If you haven't done so already, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below. It's a little red button. You punch that, and it's going to notify you every time we put out a new episode that can help you improve your bone health. And then also, if you haven't done so already, head over to BoneCoach.com, sign up for the free 7-day osteoporosis kickstart. That's going to walk you through everything you need to be doing right now to get on the path to improvement and stronger bones. After you do those two things, go ahead and press play on this episode, and I'll see you inside. Welcome to this episode of the BoneCoach Show. Joining us today to explore pelvic health and bone health is Dr. Betsy Greenleaf. Dr. Betsy Greenleaf is a premier women's health expert, a best-selling author, entrepreneur, inventor, and business leader specializing in female pelvic medicine and reconstructive surgery for over 20 years. Dr. Greenleaf is a trailblazer as the first female in the United States to become board certified in urogynecology. She possesses a professional reputation that has led to being sought after by medical societies, associations, and corporations to provide lectures, teaching, and advanced training. In 2018, she was honored with the Distinguished Fellow of the American College of Osteopathic Obstetrics and Gynecology for her service and dedication to the field. She holds committee positions on many national women's health organizations. She's a board examiner for the American Osteopathic Board of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and she serves as a spokesperson for the American Osteopathic Association. She is the owner of Greenleaf Health and Wellness, CEO of the Pelvic Floor Store, an online store dedicated to finding reliable pelvic health products. She manages a blog at drbetsygreenleaf.com, and she's the host of Some of Your Parts podcast, dedicated to women's wellness and the notion that you are greater than the sum of your parts. And Body, Mind, and Spirit podcast focuses on the trinity of total health. She's a best-selling co-author of You Were Made to Be Unstoppable. She will host, Dr. Greenleaf will take a holistic mind, body, spirit approach to healing and wellness. She believes many of the answers to a healthy life are found within, and she views her role in life as your wellness guide. So Dr. Greenleaf, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be speaking with you.
Hey, I'm glad you could be here. So let's dive right in. As I was reading through your bio and came across the word urogynecology, I wanted to know if you could explain and share with our audience what a urogynecologist is.
I know, that's a funny term, because when I did my training in obstetrics and gynecology, I came home and I told my mom, I'm like, I'm going to go do 2 more years of training in urogynecology. And she thought it was like some kind of fancy gynecology, like European, like Euro Disney. And I'm like, no, it has to do with a combination of urology, having to do with the urinary tract, and gynecology, dealing with the pelvic organs. So urogynecologists do a little bit more with the pelvis. We do things like incontinence and prolapse and recurrent urinary tract infections. So it's a combination of both. And it's a new specialty since the 1970s. And it just recently became board certified in the early 2000s. So there's only about 1,500 urogynecologists across the country. So.
Wow, that's amazing. And at what point is someone saying, you know what, let me go make an appointment with a urogynecologist?
I think the biggest problem in general is women, we don't always talk about what's going on. And I can't tell you how many women come through the door and they think they're the only one that things are happening to, especially in the pelvic area. And really, it's very common. In fact, 50% of women, especially women who've given birth, will develop a prolapse, like a drooping or the dropping of the pelvic organs as they age. So it's really something. I mean, I always start with the gynecologist, make sure you're getting your yearly checkups. But a lot of times, if you're finding that things just don't feel quite right, maybe something's bulging and you're like, oh my God, what is that? Or if you're having kind of leaking of your cough, laugh, sneeze, or you're like running to get to the bathroom and you're like, make way, and you're having a hard time holding in your urine, that may be when it's time to go see a specialist for a little bit more in-depth look into what's going on.
And typically what happens, during those appointments or conversations and yeah, I'd be interested in that.
Yeah, so it's pretty much like going to a gynecologist. I mean, any doctor, you get the background with the history and see what's going on. The difference being when a woman goes to a gynecologist, a lot of times they're laying on their back on a table with their legs in stirrups to be examined. And what's happening is that's not a natural position for our bodies to be in. So the doctors aren't able to see the full effects of gravity. And unfortunately, we all are kind of victims of gravity. Everything does start to droop and drop on all of us as we get older. And so what happens when a woman is in that position, if she has a weakness in the ligaments of the pelvic floor or the ligaments that are holding up the bladder or the vagina or the uterus or the rectum, sometimes it doesn't get looked, it gets overlooked during a regular gynecologic exam. So sometimes patients look at me like I'm crazy when I'm like, okay, well, now I'm going to get you standing up. And while you're standing, I mean, we can't look in with a speculum, but we a lot of times will take our fingers and put them within a woman while they're standing, and we can say, oh, okay, we can feel like, okay, this is drooping or that's dropping. And so we definitely get more of what's going on from a functional standpoint too, because we really can see where things are.
That's great. And then, let's say an issue is identified at that point. What's typically the next step for someone after that's identified?
This is so interesting because it has changed over the years. That's the nice thing about medicine, and especially in urogynecology, because it's a new field, it has changed drastically, I would say, in the last 15 years, last 10 years. I mean, when I trained in the early 2000s in the reconstructive surgery, it was like, okay, the bladder's dropping, the uterus is dropping, things aren't where they're supposed to be, you get surgery. Like, everybody was just like, okay, you get surgery. When in fact, some women have heard about vaginal mesh. I mean, there's used to be commercials all the time, like, those 1-800 bad drug commercials where they're like, have you been injured by vaginal mesh? And so when your organs are drooping and dropping, it's a type of hernia. It's a pelvic hernia. And mesh has been used to repair hernias for years, I mean, the abdominal wall. So when they came out with, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, they came out with this vaginal mesh to kind of like hold up the bladder, hold up the uterus. It was just thought like, oh, let's put this stuff in, and not realizing that the pelvic organs, you have to have some movement in that area. The bladder has to be able to fill and then empty. The vagina has to be able to move with sexual activity. The rectum is moving with stool that comes through. And so the mesh really didn't allow for that movement. And some women developed pain conditions, or even worse, where the mesh kind of wore into organs or kind of came out of the body. So as I went through, and I trained during this time, and it was literally like everybody got surgery, and I started to look at things different. And I still think if you go to a surgeon, they're going to recommend surgery. But from my standpoint, I look at things more holistically, and I start going, okay, well, what is going on? Is it affecting your quality of life? And if it's not affecting your quality of life enough that requires surgery, then you could always put surgery off. As long as it's not causing you medical problems. Most of the time, these pelvic health issues like prolapse where things are dropping, it's not a surgical emergency. I mean, some women will come and they'll have this bulging of tissue out of the vagina, and it's very scary because they don't know what it is, because people haven't talked about that this is something that can happen. And they think like, oh my God, do I have a tumor? Do I have cancer? Am I going to die? And so a lot of times they're looking for answers really quickly. And a lot of times it's just that the bladder is like leaning on the vagina and it's pushing the vagina out. And that bulges, they're seeing that tissue of the vagina. And really, that's not a surgical emergency. I have had women, surprisingly, where their vaginas have turned inside out like a sock and have been hanging between their legs. And we work them up to make sure it's not affecting their kidneys. But if it's not affecting their kidneys and not causing them other medical problems, it could technically be left alone. But then nowadays, there's also so many things that can be done in the meantime. I mean, other than just leaving it alone, there's pessaries, which are support devices that can be wedged in and worn in the vagina that hold everything up. And they date back all the way to ancient Egypt. And I don't recommend this, but women in ancient Egypt used to put pomegranates in their vagina to kind of wedge in there, hold things up. In ancient Rome, they used potatoes or rocks, which I do not recommend. but the scary thing is about 50% of women who have had children will develop a prolapse at some point in their lives. But it doesn't mean that, you don't necessarily have to have surgery. There's a lot of regenerative therapies that are coming out, all the way up to newer surgeries and newer procedures. So
that's great. And thanks so much for sharing that. And then in terms of the age range too, like, is there a specific age range that this is probably best to be addressed within, or when are people starting to see these and should consider addressing them? And is there an age cap where it's not a good idea to address these things beyond that?
The interesting thing is, and I talk about women having babies as being like the number one cause. And the reason that is because pregnancy and childbirth, even if you've had a C-section, the weight of a pregnancy can damage some of the ligaments in the pelvis. And so once those ligaments are damaged, they don't really heal. So they tend, and people who've given birth vaginally, those little ligaments will rip and tear, and they don't heal back up. And so, but you don't have to have had a child to have this happen. You could lift something really heavy. You could have severe constipation and bearing down. You could have like asthma or chronic bronchitis or excessive coughing, or even a really bad episode of vomiting that can really just damage those ligaments, because our pelvic floors are basically open to gravity. We don't have anything holding it in. So, and it's interesting. So why I find this interesting and kind of connects to what you're doing is the people that we're seeing osteoporosis and osteopenia in that age range where it tends to be more common, like 50s, 60s, that's when you're going to see more commonly these issues show up. Now, it can show up in somebody younger. I mean, the youngest person I ever had was a 15-year-old who was a gymnast who, from just heavy, like kind of like landing, she damaged her ligaments. It can happen the first time you have a baby. So it can happen if someone's had a child in their 20s. But the more often you're going to see this happen is going to be like 40s, 50s, 60s. And so the connection with that is it has to do with lowering estrogen levels. And so, interesting enough, there's been a number of studies that have looked at actually both osteoporosis and pelvic prolapse, or osteoporosis and stress incontinence. It's like leaking when you cough, laugh, sneeze, which is indicative of weak ligaments. And so there was actually a very large study with like 800,000 women in Korea. They did a study on this and they found a direct correlation. But the question was in their study is osteoporosis and prolapse, a weakening of the pelvic floor, directly related? And I don't think that they're directly related, but I think the process that's causing both, or one of the processes that's causing these conditions, is adding to these risks, both the risks of these conditions. So like, number one, we know nutrition affects your ligaments and your tissue health. And so nutrition can then increase your risk of prolapse and incontinence. Same thing with nutrition affecting bone health. The drop in estrogen. So as women go into that perimenopausal period, menopause, we get lowering of estrogen, which from a tissue standpoint, other than bone, I mean, I know you talk about bone, but like from other than bone, like looking at your ligaments become weaker. The vaginal mucosa becomes thinner, which adds to some support. And we also lose muscle. So we're starting to lose a lot of that muscle. At the same time, we have that lowering estrogen effect on the bones, and therefore you're at higher risk for osteopenia and osteoporosis. So I think it's the processes that are causing these conditions that are all happening typically around that age period. So.
And as you're talking about nutrients, obviously what comes to mind for me also is gut health. And is there a connection between, gut health, the vagina, other areas of the body even connected to that?
Yeah, in so many different ways. First, from a structural standpoint, we know that if your gut health is not good, you're not going to be absorbing your nutrients. So therefore, your tissue in general is going to be weaker. So you have a higher risk of these prolapse and incontinence issues. But then also, we have a lot of issues with recurrent vaginal infections because if the let's and this becomes very circular thinking. So if the gut is off, and we know that there's a microbiome in the gut, that if it's in balance, you have the healthy bacteria, then everything's great. You make 95% of your serotonin, your happy hormone, in your gut. 80% of your immune system is made in your gut. But then you throw lifestyle issues like stress, not enough sleep, not enough fluids, poor diet, inflammatory foods, and now we have issues with the gut microbiome being thrown off, stomach acid getting thrown off, overgrowth of bacteria, overgrowth of yeast. And so that affects the vagina in a number of ways. Number one, that now this causes like a leaky gut where the intestines become inflamed, and toxins from our environment, from our food, leak through the gut. Even food particles, food sensitivities leak through the gut into our system and cause inflammation. Some people, that inflammation may show up as arthritis. Some people may show up as an autoimmune disease. It can also show up as pelvic pain or bladder inflammation, like interstitial cystitis. So there's a number of ways that it can affect the pelvis like that. The other thing is, if the gut microbiome is off, the way we're built as women, when you look at a side view of the pelvis, you have the rectum, vagina, and urethra, the tube you pee through, so close to each other. And no matter how clean you are, women always think like when they're getting recurrent urinary tract infections, that's a hygiene issue. And it's not. It's just the way we're built anatomically. These structures are so close together, it's very easy for bacteria to get from one place to the other. And so what ends up happening is, if the bacteria in the gut is off, that's going to be the bacteria coming out of the stool is going to be off, which is going to be close to the vagina. And then the vaginal microbiome may get thrown off. And the vagina acts as a reservoir of bacteria and yeast that now can get into the bladder and cause recurrent urinary tract infections. So they interact very much so. And in fact, we see this more so in women who are perimenopausal and menopausal, because estrogen keeps the vaginal tissue nice and thick and healthy. And so it causes that vaginal tissue to actively grow. And when it actively grows, the dead cells slough off, and they contain something called glycogen, which is the food source for lactobacillus, which is the healthy bacteria that likes to live in the vagina. Lactobacillus keeps the vagina very acidic. It keeps it like 3.5 to 4.5 in the acid range. And because of that, these other bacteria don't want to live there. So in one way, it keeps the bad bacteria away, but also lactobacillus produces hydrogen peroxide, which also is antibacterial. So what happens is, now we go through menopause, or women who've been on birth control for long periods of time, the body perceives that it's like almost a pregnancy state, a low estrogen state, or women who are pregnant, or women who are breastfeeding, anything that's a low estrogen state. What will happen is, now the vaginal tissue will thin out and it won't actively grow and slough off. And basically the lactobacillus starves to death. And so now women are at a much higher risk of recurrent vaginal infections, recurrent urinary tract infections, pelvic pain conditions. And so it becomes like kind of very circular with the gut, because they can go to the doctor and get treated with creams and potions and antibiotics. But then what happens is, if you don't fix the gut, it's just going to come back. Or depending on the antibiotics they take, if they're taking oral antibiotics, now you're throwing the gut off more, so making them at an increased risk for recurrent urinary tract infections and vaginal infections. So
aside from just supporting good gut health, are there other ways to support a healthy vaginal microbiome?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things is, for women who are perimenopausal or postmenopausal, the biggest thing is addressing that thinning of the tissue. So, unfortunately, I think as humans, we're never meant to live as long as we do. So I don't think, cave women were really having to deal with these things. But really, I mean, we're way outliving our reproductive years. So we got to start looking into using things to kind of regenerate that vaginal tissue and keep it healthy, or products that contain glycogen that actually help to feed the healthy bacteria. Or I love boric acid suppositories. There's company PhD, Feminine Health, awesome. That helps to basically make the vaginal microbiome more acidic and make it more acidic so that the healthy bacteria want to live there. But then you also have to consider looking at keeping that tissue thick and healthy. And this is where it gets a little controversial, because of up until probably about 2016, the only options that were on the market were using estrogens. So vaginal estrogen products, which were really synthetic estrogens. And also a lot of those over the counter, not over the prescription products contain uh, polyglycol, so which is really irritating to the mucosal membrane. So it was like, all right, you're using this thing that's supposed to make the vagina healthy, but it can be very irritating to some people, and you're having synthetic hormones, which are not as great as natural hormones when it comes to vaginal health. But they still exist. They're still, some people, they're really good option. And a lot of them are prescription covered. But since then, they've developed some newer bioidentical prescription products. Hormones like DHEA can be taken, and they make DHEA suppositories that can place in the vagina. And then also about in 2016, they started looking at regenerative therapies that were used for bazillions of years for cosmetic purposes. I mean, lasers have been around since the 1980s for regeneration of skin. They use it on face all the time for cosmetic purposes. And I wish I'd come up with it. Somebody was like, wait a minute, if you can use it on the face, why can't you use it in the vagina? And they created a vaginal laser that was available in the United States in 2016. Mona Lisa Touch was the first one. Now there's many, many different companies that make their version of it. But that is non-hormonal and uses light energy. So the light energy penetrates the tissue, and it's almost like biohacking. It penetrates the tissue and causes a microscopic injury, and the body responds to that by flooding the tissue with growth factors, and it actually triggers the vaginal tissue to regrow for about a year. And it will wear off in about a year because we can't stop the aging process, but it's a great option that's not hormonal. And then out of that, there's been all these different products using red light therapy, using something called carboxy therapy. Anything they can use for like cosmetic for regeneration, they're now applying it to the vagina, like platelet-rich plasma. There's so many different ways. So keeping the vaginal tissue healthy will also help support the microbiome. Keeping the diet healthy is going to support the microbiome. So
That's amazing. This is absolutely amazing and super helpful, and I'm sure for our audience too. Are there any other things that you think are important, for our audience to consider that, most of them are women 50 to 65 plus that have osteopenia, osteoporosis. Obviously they care about making sure their entire body is healthy, but anything else that you think is important to share with them?
A couple of things, but I'm going to talk about the microbiome, which is really fascinating. They're doing research right now on,
Yeah.
is that they're finding out if the vaginal microbiome is off, it can affect sex drive. And so a lot of women think like, oh, I'm menopausal or perimenopausal, and that's why my sex drive is down. You know what? Sometimes going on hormones doesn't fix the problem. It could actually be a sign that the vaginal microbiome is off. And it originally came out of fertility research that they discovered this, because the body's really smart. Because if the vaginal microbiome is off, the body will sense, okay, you know what, this is not an ideal time to reproduce. And so they found that women with this issue had higher risks of infertility, because the body starts suppressing its hormones and the sex drive, because it's like, well, you know what, it's not a good time to have a pregnancy. Well, they've taken that research further and they go, wait a minute, what about women who are not in their reproductive years, and they're finding the same thing, is that if the vaginal microbiome is off, if you've tried hormones and you've tried other things and it's not working, it could be that the microbiome is off, and that's sending a feedback loop to your brain that this is not an ideal time to reproduce. And your brain doesn't know the difference between you wanting to have a baby versus you want to have fun. So the same process happens. So, and then I think my biggest thing that I always talk about is the trinity of health: body, mind, spirit. As physicians, as health practitioners, we can address the body, but you could be eating perfectly, you could be exercised perfectly. But if you're not doing some basic things like getting enough sleep, drinking enough fluids, like 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated. So if you're not drinking enough fluids, if you're not addressing your stress levels, whether that be through meditation, a hobby, spending time with friends, doing something that kind of just makes you feel part of a community, then your health is going to be out of balance. So all three legs of that stool, body, mind, spirit, have to be in balance for you to have total health. And that's going to affect not only pelvic health, but that's going to affect, things with osteoporosis. So, take a look, because I know as a health practitioner, if I could exercise for you, I would do it. If I could meditate for you, I would do it, but I can't. These are like, I said, it's kind of like Dorothy and Wizard of Oz. I mean, you have the power within you all along. And so we're just tools here to help you and guide you, but really you can do this. So
wise words, Dr. Betsy, appreciate that. And I want to make sure if there's, if our audience wants to find you, where can they find you at? And I know you also have a summit coming up just shortly here. I think, what is it? One of the dates for that summit too. Let's go ahead and share
it. It is right now, June 9th through 12th of 2022. Okay. And so it's called the Happy Vagina Rally, and BoneCoach Kevin Ellis is part of it. So you're going to be able to see him there.
That's right.
Have tons of specialists talking about not just pelvic health, but also all things menopause and just general wellness. So that you can find that at happyvaginarally.com. But make sure we're going to be giving Kevin a link specifically for his audience. Make sure you use that link in the show notes. You could also find me on social media, and unfortunately, I wish I could say I had the same name across all social media, but that didn't happen. But if you just look up Dr. Betsy Greenleaf, or Instagram is Dr. Betsy Greenleaf _, you can find me there. I have the Pelvic Floor Store pelvicfloorstore.com is a website where we have products, and we're really focusing on education this year, as not as much as products, but and then my website, which is drbetsygreenleaf.com.
And are some of the things, I know you were mentioning certain things that we were going through here. Some of those things, can they be found over there too?
Yeah. And in fact, awesome. I have tons of products. Basically, it was all the products that I was recommending to my patients and they were having hard times finding. I kind of put them together, and then we're actually in the process of developing some of our own specific products too. So we're kind of overhauling the website, but it's really exciting, because before we were a product company. Now I want to be an education company that happens to sell products. So we're going to be focusing more on education and the education of how to use these products too.
That's amazing. Well, I love your energy. I love what you do. You're just an awesome person. And thanks so much again for taking part. And for those of you listening or watching, you can find all the resources, show notes, everything mentioned here over at bonecoach.com/bone health, pelvic health, Dr. Betsy Greenleaf. Thanks so much for watching this episode. I'll see you in the next one. Hey, it's Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. Hope you found that episode helpful and that you enjoyed it. Just one last reminder, if you haven't done so already, head over to bonecoach.com, sign up for your free 7-day osteoporosis kickstart. It's going to tell you everything you need to do to start getting on the path to improvement. Hope you found this helpful. I'm your Bone Coach Kevin Ellis. I'll see you soon.